Welcome, everyone. I'm Marcia Lovett, Director of the Eberly Center, Senior Associate Vice Provost for Educational Innovation, and a teaching professor in the Department of Psychology, all at Carnegie Mellon University. This is the fifth event in our new series of 10 book conversations, Academic Innovation and the Public Good, ongoing dialogues with authors about how education can innovate in ways that are informed, humane, and rooted. Carnegie Mellon is a co-sponsor of this series, along with 16 other higher education institutions listed on the slide you see here. And Notre Dame has just signed on as a co-sponsor, so they'll be added to the list by our next event in June. The series is co-organized by Stanford Digital Education and Trinity College. Additional partners include the Stanford Humanities Center's Recovering the University as a Public Good initiative and the Stanford Pathways Lab. Each event features a prominent author of a new book in the field in conversation with an expert colleague about their work. For a full list of participating authors and interviewers, please visit our event calendar. You can find a link to it in the Zoom chat. Tonight's event has a special feature. Sarah Stein Greenberg will be leading us in a live demo of the blind contour drawing activity from her book, Creative Acts for Curious People. So make sure to have a pen and paper so you can join in. At the end of the event, we encourage you to post your drawing and share your thoughts about it in our online community space, ai4pg.gatherlearning.com. Again, that's AI, the number 4, pg.gatherlearning.com. You'll have a chance to talk with others about Sarah's ideas for fostering creativity. Plus, those who post a drawing by Friday, May 27th will be automatically entered to win one of 3 signed copies of Sarah's book. Winners will be selected via random drawing and notified by email. For those who want to be sure to get a copy of Sarah's book, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. The link is in the chat. A limited number of signed copies will be available. With that, I am pleased to introduce Sarah Stein Greenberg, Executive Director of the Stanford D.School, also known as Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. Her book, Creative Acts for Curious People, How to Think, Create, and Lead in Unconventional Ways, offers ideas, assignments, and anecdotes to inspire creativity and leadership. She will be interviewed tonight by Allison Salisbury, a Senior Vice President at Guild Education, which provides companies with an education platform to upskill their workers. Thank you for joining us tonight, Sarah and Allison. I'm very grateful to both of you for being part of this series. Before I turn the floor over to Sarah, I want to briefly outline the format of tonight's program. This conversation is part of an ongoing dialogue. As such, we will be leaving the Zoom chat room open for comments and questions. We will monitor the Zoom chat for instances of inappropriate or disruptive language, and if necessary, we will remove users from the event. Following the conclusion of tonight's author conversation, we will open the floor to audience questions. If you would like to submit a question during the event, please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Again, thank you for joining us. Take it away, Sarah.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. And Marcia, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Allison, I cannot wait to get into our conversation. I know it's going to be a really rich one because you have such fabulous experience in design and in higher education. But before we do that, I am such a believer in experiential learning, which is, running all the way through Creative Acts. I thought it would be fun if we could just start with a demo of the very first assignment that is in the book. And I'll set this up very briefly. And then as my willing participant, I'll give the directions and appreciate your participation. And actually, I'll say that anybody at home who just quickly around you, if you happen to have one piece of paper and one writing implement, that is all you need. And it would be really fun to have you do the assignment along with us. And then maybe that will help inform some of the questions. So within the book, are a whole series of assignments that we teach and that we practice, that we've developed at the D.school over the years. And many of them are really about isolating like one critical muscle or one part of design work or an ability that we use a lot in design, and giving someone the opportunity to actually experience what that behavior feels like, and then to do some reflection and some critical evaluation of what that provoked. So the blind contour portrait works as follows. Allison, you and I are going to draw a portrait of each other. Now, I'm not a trained artist. I don't know about you. So we might stretch a little bit out of our comfort zones. And the rules are as follows. We're going to take just 30 seconds. I have a timer all ready to go. We're going to look at each other. And the rule is we can't take our eyes and look at our paper. So no looking down. And secondly, once you touch your pen to the paper, you cannot remove that. So no skipping around, no checking your work partway through. That is the goal, is to produce a portrait within those constraints. So do you have your supplies?
I have my supplies. And for those following at home, this is the first time I've done this activity as well.
All right. Well, without further ado, I got the timer going. So let's go ahead and start drawing. And please feel free to, anything that comes up while you're drawing. I want to hear about it.
You want to hear about it live?
I would love to hear about it live.
I'm honestly wondering if I'm drawing on the paper.
Well, that is a really good question, and you'll find out soon. Okay, you're so interesting. Your long hair is sort of like my guide for how I've started, and now I need a way to get to your eyes and nose. It's going to be interesting. Oh, that was my timer. So let's just take 5 more seconds and then wrap up. We can see what we're doing. All right. Okay. Time's up. Right. Go ahead. Take pens down. All right. So the first thing we do, even before we're going to show each other, is I'm going to write your name on top. And then, of course, as the proud artist that we are, let's just go ahead and add a little signature. All right. So on the count of 3, let's hold up our portraits. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Ooh, you have a beautiful, like, flowing line.
I can see my hair portrait very distinctly.
That's right. I really got to the hair, and then I got like a little hung up about like, where was I going to put the rest of your features? And as we can see, they went somewhere in a sort of
little squiggly in the middle. Yeah.
I feel like your detail on the ears. I feel like my ears have never been treated in such a careful way.
I was doing some figure 8ing for your eyes. I didn't know exactly how that would turn out. It did turn out that I was drawing on the paper. I have a whiteboard desk, so if I had gone off the paper, it would have been okay.
And you really filled the paper too. So I feel like you had some kind of intuition about the scope of your canvas. Mm-hmm. And one thing that's really interesting is like my lines feel very like jagged and sort of close tonight, and yours are like very open and like free and loose, which is just sort of interesting. I don't know, maybe I'm over interpreting, but like how were you feeling when you were doing this?
I felt very relaxed, honestly, and definitely just like kind of flowing with it, following the big contours of your sort of shoulders, your head, your eyes. And I'm noticing it looks like maybe at the very end when you realize we had 5 seconds, maybe you did the little squiggle in the middle. I feel like I finished at the very end with like, oh, I got to get her other ear. And so it was just interesting to see what we both did when we were sort of rushed at the end there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of glad that like that timer caught me a little off guard, and then I just like put something down. And I think thinking about that makes me realize like I was being careful as I was trying to get the outline right. And I was not quite like I was trying to perform a little bit, I think probably because of the live nature of this exercise, the public nature of this.
Yeah. I have no natural talents as an artist. And what was interesting for me is when I didn't have a plan. I'd never done the activity before. I'd read the prompt in your book, but I didn't have a plan. And so I just had to keep kind of flowing with it till I felt like I had completed the full circle of your head.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. So, I mean, one of the reasons that we do this activity, and we often do it like at the very beginning of a class, and then sometimes also at the very end, is because this activity is really wonderful for helping people locate their inner critic. So I don't know, did you have any moment where you were like really thinking about, am I getting this right? Or am I like, what did that voice come up, and what does it sound like for you?
Because I have, I mean, no drawing skills whatsoever, it did come up for me. I literally just spatially did not know if what I was drawing would make any kind of intuitive sense. And I think the sort of an extra pressure of then showing it to however many people are on the line. So I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what it would look like. And was sort of surprised at the end. It was like a full circle of a head and some shoulders.
Yeah, you almost, I realize in retrospect, like you sort of set the bar really low. You were like, I don't even know if I'm on the paper, right? Then of course, like you're right in the middle of the paper. So I don't know, maybe there was like a little expectation setting going on.
Yeah.
And the other thing that this is a really wonderful experience for is that so often in creative work, we like let that judgment, that critical faculty creep in, when in fact, what we're trying to do is just produce something. And what we often think about in design is like being very intentional about separating the process of generating work or generating ideas and then critiquing them. And it's really important to do both, right? You often want to try to push yourself to get beyond obvious ideas and to come up with a whole range of different concepts. To do that, you often have to like silence that internal censor, or maybe censors, on some critics on your team or in your environment. And the discipline to recognize, like, when is that little internal voice creeping up for me? And this kind of experience helps remind you, creates almost like just like a bodily reminder of the practice and the discipline that it takes to separate producing from judging. And that is a theme that reoccurs over and over in design work, being really intentional and specific about, when am I in what mode? Am I producing work? Am I criticizing it or judging it and selecting the best ideas? Am I coming up with lots of ideas right now? Or am I trying to actually converge on a few that are going to make it to the next round of work?
Yeah, I really like that, because that self-critic is a tool. It's a really powerful tool. It's one we actually do want to use and deploy sometimes, but seeing it as one that we want to selectively deploy, and that we want to dial it up, we want to dial it down, we want to do that intentionally, I think is like an incredibly fruitful exercise. Last question on this, and I think we can dive into the conversation. I imagine you've done this activity a bunch of times. How was it different for you, knowing you're doing it in front of others and using it as a teaching tool for today?
I mean, one thing that was really different for me is that and you'll read this in the book, the normal time frame is 60 seconds. And I really got taken off guard with the 30 seconds. So for me, this was actually a really productive stretch, because I was like used to one thing, and then this actually did pull me out of something that I've gotten kind of comfortable with over time. So, for me tonight, this actually functioned as a better lesson personally, a better reminder of some of these skills. And it's made me realize that I have acclimated to the prompt as it's written. And actually what's really that's a nice reminder to myself from a pedagogical perspective, is like, if you stay in that safety zone, if you stay in that comfort zone, like you stop learning after a while. So this was quite a fruitful, I've done this many times, but not with a 30-second window. So I actually appreciate the chance to challenge myself a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. Really fun, and hope everyone enjoyed it, doing it in their own space at home. Let's dive into some conversation. So just a little bit of framing at the top for people. One of the things that actually motivated me to get into education in the first place is that you sometimes have these moments where the thing you want to teach, the curriculum you want to build, the capacities you want to sort of impart, are the things that you yourself want to get better at. And I think this zone is one of those zones where I think we can have sort of this dual conversation this evening around, how do we want to build sort of the capacities of modern learners to be designers in our world, and to actually enact public good through the work they do beyond sort of their time within academic institutions. And we can have a conversation around how these creative acts, these tools of design, can actually help leaders of academic institutions and organizations who partner with them transform how those institutions work to better serve the needs of the broader public. So I think we'll try to have this conversation at both altitudes and with both lenses. And for people listening at home, just maybe pick the lens that feels most relevant to you, or maybe stay with both of them, because I think we'll be able to move between them as we go. So to start, let's maybe start with an easy question, I hope, which is, why does the world need more designers? And what's at stake if we don't create more people with that toolkit?
I think this is a great place to start. Not an easy question, but one that I have a lot of thoughts on, and I'm curious to hear yours as well. So, I think of design as in its modern form as this incredibly flexible problem-solving approach, creative problem-solving approach, but also a really important way to notice and to see and identify which are the problems that you want to solve, and often challenging the framing that you may have inherited or you may have come to initially through that process of noticing and seeing, and then, as I said, reframing. And so we often think about design at the D.School as a relationship between problem solving and problem finding. And there are then a lot of abilities that go into that. And what I think is really important to call out about today's context is that all of us, no matter what we do professionally, no matter what our home life or family life or community life looks like, I mean, just in the past 2 years, we have all been called upon to try to solve problems that we haven't faced before, that keep changing, that are dynamic. And that requires an ability to really say, well, if I keep trying to solve these problems in the same way that I've been approaching other problems, like I may not get there, right? I actually have to have some kind of new creative approaches. So, whether just in the past 2 years of the pandemic, or thinking about all of the broad social challenges that we face these days, environmental challenges, I mean, the list could go on. I think that having a way to lean into new, unknown, open-ended, and very dynamic kinds of opportunities and challenges is quite important. And I really believe, because I've seen it over and over in our work, that design offers that kind of tool set. It is a way to fundamentally help people be able to start out saying, I don't know the answer, right? Which is actually a really big mindset shift for a lot of us, particularly in education. Like we're supposed to have the answer, right? And to be able to say, I don't have the answer, but like I have a way to start to dig into this problem, and I know I'm going to learn more about it along the way. And some of the ways that design helps you do that is through these skills around noticing what's not obvious and surfacing and finding new patterns. We use a lot of visual tools around mapping and combining data in sort of unconventional ways, which provokes very interesting insights. And then, as we were talking about before, pushing yourself to come up with lots of ideas, not judging, and then selecting a few to actually build models or prototypes around and testing those and getting feedback. And that allows you to have, an initial idea that is not the end solution, but to actually get feedback, to test it, to seek the advice and the contribution of the people who are part of the broader stakeholder landscape. And that, I think, offers that set of approaches offers us a very, very powerful way to work in community on difficult challenges and potentially to come up with really novel or innovative solutions.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I would say probably the most intensive through line of my interest in education has been actually, how do you cultivate like civic mindedness and civic action through education? And I stumbled upon this framework a long time ago that has continued to stick with me, which is, let's say a community with a food desert. What is the solution? And to get to your problem finding, problem solution framework, what's the solution? Well, you could volunteer at a food pantry. You could recognize that the community didn't have a food pantry. You could organize and build one. Or you could do systemic diagnosis of, why is there hunger in this community, and do need finding in that way, and then actually work to solve that systemic challenge. And I've always felt like this framework was a great way of really understanding the skills and capabilities we need to cultivate civically in order to be able to do the change work required in that sort of third level of citizenship. And I think the tools of design are actually one of the most effective ways to actually activate the capabilities and the mindsets and the beliefs for people to sort of drive change in that capacity.
I love that framework. And I think, one thing that folks might be thinking when they just hear the word design is like, oh, the aesthetics or the end finishing, right? The kind of the things that make it beautiful or elegant or pleasing to use. And the way that we think about design is actually at all of those levels that you mentioned. So it might be like, what is the flow of how people might move through the food pantry if building a food pantry turns out to be the right solution. But it's also about what's the protocol that the staff uses to make people feel welcome and to destigmatize the experience of getting food from the food pantry. And beyond that, it's like, what are the systems in place that make sure that there's food in the food pantry, that the shelves are stocked? And so all of those, right, the experience, the physical environment, and the systems behind it, as well as the human interactions that you might need to design, all of those are places where you can use these approaches to be extremely intentional about what is the experience or the impact or the outcome that you're trying to create. And I think that, you know, as we continue to see the definition of design expand, we're faced with greater and greater complexity. So I love your model because it basically it affirms the idea that one, design can happen in all of those elements. And also it raises the provocation of like, to not go in thinking that you know which of those levels is the right one to start out at.
Presupposing what the solution is, being very dangerous. So you talk about, I feel like extensively in your book, probably throughout of it, the sort of the role that feelings play. And so in particular, there's this one quote: we make a lot of room, a lot of time for feelings, and we act like it is no different than doing any other kind of work. So just tell me a little bit about that, why it's important in the work and how that shows up in design.
Yes, so feelings really run throughout design work, and one of the kind of surface level ways that you often see, particularly with students starting to encounter it, is the experience that you have when you are conducting an interview, or you're observing, or you're immersing in an environment, and you start to build some trust and some rapport, and you might hear something that someone is really confiding, right? That's about a difficult experience that they had, you know, perhaps around food insecurity, or maybe in a clinical environment within a medical system, or I mean, really, it could be just about anything. And recognizing that when someone is expressing emotion, there's often a really important thread to follow there. There could be a really powerful expression of values or beliefs. There could be a really deep unmet need that's there. And so often we want to really listen carefully for when people, in the process of trying to actually uncover what the needs might be, when people start to get into very emotional territory. You have to be really respectful. You need to be well trained to handle that appropriately. But that's where we also see students start to gain some real perspective and empathy, and start to actually be motivated to try to help. Like when you're really sitting across from someone and you hear some powerful needs in these areas, often I see with students like a real shift happens where they develop a real sense of urgency about wanting to address something, which can be quite powerful. Then on a totally different level, another place where we see emotion come up is in team dynamics, right? Like it's really hard work to navigate, especially with a group of people, particularly with our students who are often coming from all different parts of the university. So you might have somebody who's studying to be a lawyer, working with somebody who's studying to be an engineer, working with somebody who's in business, and somebody's in English. And those folks are going to have a really different way of contributing and of assessing what a problem means, even like different definitions of what does data look like. And so often the design process starts to become a common vocabulary, but there are still moments where you're really trying to sort out, like, well, what do we think is the right direction, right? Should we converge, or do we need to continue to come up with new ideas? Well, how are we interpreting the feedback that we're getting while we're testing our ideas? And so we see often the need to really build a core of skills around the interpersonal issues that can come up when you're working together. You have to have trust, you have to have psychological safety, and all of that takes work as well.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. And it always has struck me how we, that the work of innovation is typically highly cognitive in nature, and that's how we view it. But anyone, I think, who's been a part of social change management, innovation, whatever word you want to give it, I think will tell you where it's gone wrong is when people don't feel valued, where they don't feel heard, where they don't feel respected, where they don't feel aligned. And those are, I'm feeling, as actually the qualifier for all of those things. And so actually building the practices into our work, building the muscle to have those conversations with our colleagues, but also use it as data for our design work, I think is one of the most remarkable innovations of the design process.
I'll also say that there's an important feeling that is sometimes very questioned in contexts that are maybe exploring design for the first time, which is the hunch. Like you have to take some speculative leaps and make some inferences when you're working in this way. And we always want to test those out, right? We don't want to stay in the realm of hypothesis. And that's why we often build prototypes and then test them and get tons of feedback and realize, oh, we were wrong. But to get to that stage, you have to take that leap. And so I think a part of what we're trying to do with our students is to help them find that balance between really critically analyzing and understanding the system and the environment, but then also the permission, the explicit permission to try to have a little bit of internal trust to kind of get something out that then is worthy of testing.
Yeah, internal trust, but also the external trust. So I think we probably all have those colleagues where we feel like can I just test this idea on you really quickly? And those are our most generative moments. And so how do we bring that sort of trust-based creativity, my hunch plus your hunch actually equals the big idea? I think those are the moments that we're trying to foster within our work.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I want to switch a little bit to ambiguity, which is another theme that comes up quite a bit in the work. And I think there is no one who works in and around education right now who could say that their work is not ambiguous. I think COVID has radically changed the questions that we're asking, the power dynamics in our institutions. So tell me a little bit about ambiguity in design, the role it plays. And it's also, I think, just notable to me, I can't read a job description these days that doesn't include comfortable with fast-paced, ambiguous environments. So it's becoming a requirement actually to work at any and all organizations, including our academic institutions. So talk to me a little about the role it plays.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's interesting is I think probably very few of us, and this is a question posed by one of my colleagues, Lisa Solomon, like very few of us took a class in ambiguity in college or at any stage in our educations, right? And yet exactly what you're saying, Allison, is like that is now like a requirement for functioning in the professional world. And the reasons for that are obvious given the context that we're in. So I would say we think about ambiguity in a couple of ways. One thing I want to do is distinguish ambiguity from uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So uncertainty is like a part and parcel of life. Like we never can actually predict what the future holds. And right now, where there's uncertainty on so many different fronts, I think we are having a collective like emotional amplification of what does uncertainty mean for each of us. Ambiguity really means, at least what it means to me, is not knowing and that multiple things could be true, right? Multiple interpretations could be true. Multiple directions could be of interest or of value. And one of the things that we try to help our students think about is without ambiguity, you actually can't have innovation, right? If you start a project and you're like, I know exactly what the answer is, it's just very unlikely to be something that is new or kind of a non-traditional way of thinking about it. And in some cases, maybe that is the right solution, particularly if you're in an execution mode. But if what you're looking for is a new way to do something, to solve a problem that's been around for a long time, or to build on something that's going really well and take it to scale, you often need to acknowledge that you won't know exactly how to get there. And that is actually what ambiguity is, right? So starting to think of ambiguity as a potential ingredient in your creative work is often where we're trying to get our students to position themselves in terms of thinking about and relating to ambiguity. Now, this is really hard because human beings, most of us are quite intolerant of ambiguity. And we often, including in creative work, exhibit what's called a rush to closure. Like the desire to get out of that messy part of the process where you're still investigating multiple directions and you're not sure, and are we going to make it on time, and am I going to hit the deadline, and what's my dean going to think? And I mean, all of that stuff, totally human, totally natural, but it often causes us to foreclose the creative process too quickly. And what we like to do is to help students figure out, how do you stay in that ambiguity for a little bit longer, for the right amount of time, to potentially be able to explore that broader range of solutions. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that one of our team members, a couple of them actually, have done some interesting work with students around how do you express your own relationship to ambiguity, and thinking critically about like, if you were to talk about and think about an experience you've had recently of navigating ambiguity and what came up for you, think about like a metaphor that you would use to describe that. Like, is ambiguity like walking through a dark forest? Is ambiguity like jumping off a cliff and parachuting? It's like thrilling, even though it's a little dangerous. Sometimes we see that students are able to express those metaphors and then have a real sense of how to talk about their own disposition and their own relationship with ambiguity with each other. And I will say some of those resources are available. We made a library of ambiguity because we're really quite fascinated by it. And it's the role that it plays in creative work. And so we can drop some of those links in the chat at the end in case that's useful for folks.
That's great. And I hope for people who are sort of leading change work at their institutions or organizations, you're thinking to yourself, sort of, how do I actually help my colleagues come along through ambiguity? How do I help them see it as part of the process? How do I help them see it as actually part of the productive discomfort that hopefully leads to those breakthrough insights? As we sort of wrap up, I'm curious to turn it to you. Like, you are a change agent in your own institution, and have done just quite a bit with the D.school at Stanford and really shaping a new way of doing teaching and learning around design. Tell me a little bit about what you've learned in that process, what you feel like has sort of been your biggest success and maybe hardest learning.
Well, that's a wonderful question. I'll say one thing that I'm quite proud of was a recognition that we had quite a few years ago, that even though we had a lot of extremely creative faculty and instructors who are working together and creating really innovative, really interesting new courses, we still needed ways to make sure that we were having an opportunity to experiment rapidly, right? Because the cycle of a course development is often like, you teach it perhaps once a year and then it kind of simmers on the back burner while you're doing all your other things. And then you might reinvestigate it and think about iterating. And so we actually wanted an opportunity to have a faster cycle of innovation. And so out of that need, we created something that initially we called pop-up classes. And these were shorter format classes that really enabled teaching teams to come together and experiment with new pedagogy, new content, maybe a new collaboration across disciplines or a new project partner. And one of the interesting things that then happened from there, like someone else took that program over and pushed it into a new format that we called pop-out classes, which all took place off campus. And that was in an era, this was led by Carissa Carter, who's now our academic director, where we really, really wanted to deepen students' experiences of working in community and really to push the sort of like observational and collaborative nature of what they were doing. And we've iterated again. Those are now in the form of lots of different types of day-long workshops. So we're trying a new model. So I'll just say that, you know, we have had to continue to make sure that we are creating the kind of the test beds for ourselves. And that, like, even if you have the most dynamic and innovative and creative team, like, you still have to create those conditions. You have to set those conditions up in a really intentional way to ensure that you're giving explicit permission and you're making it possible for people to continue to experiment. So I would say that's a, you know, I'm really proud of that. And then I'm also really proud that it's continued to evolve over time as our needs as an organization have changed.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I think we will turn to audience questions now. Looks like I have one that's come in so far, and definitely encourage people to put your questions into the chat. Is ambiguity the foundation for conversation, or is it essential discussion? So what do you think?
Well, I will just say I am going to own that I'm not sure I fully understand what the question is in terms of its relationship to ambiguity relating to conversation. I'll say that I think it is absolutely essential in creative work, and I think, however, it is often pretty excluded in a lot of organizational contexts, right? Like we really try to create more predictability and reduce uncertainty and ambiguity in a lot of organizational contexts. So I personally think it is 100% essential. I'm so curious about what the person who asked this question was thinking in terms of its relationship to conversation. So, I mean, I also am curious, Allison, like you've had so much experience in higher ed using design. Like, are there places where you have seen ambiguity invited in? Or like what's your own sort of relationship with ambiguity in the creative work that you've been leading and seeing?
Yeah, you had this framework in your book that I think is sort of very theoretical at this point about different ways that people interact and engage with ambiguity. And I'm definitely in this sort of embrace zone. It's actually when I have the most fun at work, is when I feel like I'm in that moment of like dot connecting and not quite through where to break through. And I love it. But I do find that it creates quite a bit of discomfort for a number of colleagues who are used to sort of the strategic planning muscle, right? Like, what is our plan? How will we get there? What are the milestones? What are the metrics? How do we know we've been successful? And if that's what you're looking for, and that's what you're used to as your operating system, the trust the process, right? This converging and diverging experience of we're actually running a design process. By definition, we don't know the answer, but we know the set of questions we're going to ask, and we trust the process to get us there. That is just culturally so different, not just for people in higher ed, but I work for quite an entrepreneurial company right now, and there's quite a few people who still, it's like not something they're really quite accustomed to doing. And I see a question in the chat, and I'll answer it myself and then tee it to you. But like, what do you do when you're okay with ambiguity, but those you're working with perhaps aren't? I find it to be a teachable moment on the process. And actually, to describe it, I think one of the things about design is that it's done a great job naming and claiming the phase of a process to say, oh, you feel uncomfortable right now. That's actually how it's supposed to feel. That's normal. And then building some confidence by showing examples of how that process has actually led to success in the past. And so I don't think that always works, but I find that just naming it, like, this is going to feel uncomfortable today. Then the session feels uncomfortable, and then you close by saying, I told you so. It basically allows people to go, oh, I'm like in good hands. This was the expectation that I feel this way. It doesn't mean we're going off the rails. But I'm curious sort of what your sort of tips and tricks are if you're working with people who aren't as comfortable in that environment.
Yeah, so I think naming it, I think that the metaphor exercise that I described, particularly if you do it across a team, then you get to have a very rich conversation with people about where they kind of fit in those different categories around whether they tend to embrace ambiguity or endure it or engage it selectively. And I'll also say that I found there's a tool in the book, it's called a learning journey map. And often at the end of a course or even a shorter workshop, we'll have students or participants reflect back on the moments when they felt like they were learning a lot, or how they were feeling across time, across the duration of the learning experience. And where you see people reporting or reflecting that they were learning a lot, but they were stressed or anxious or feeling, that discomfort, I think that's those moments of what you just named productive discomfort or productive struggle. And helping people have that vocabulary, I think is quite useful. So often, like I might share some of those journey maps that I've collected from students in the past to say it might come at different times. But I think the idea that when you're in those moments of struggle is often right when you're near that breakthrough, right? It's like you can feel, the team feels it's getting more and more intense, and surfacing this, naming it, understanding the different dispositions as a team, all of those I think are really, really useful in acknowledging that ambiguity affects the feelings that we have about the work that we're doing as we are doing it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I'm getting more questions about ambiguity here. So there's two that have a similar theme, which is around how to champion this kind of creative process in environments like higher ed that, this one question says, I often feel stifled by rigid hierarchies and a feeling of we have always done it this way mindset. How do I break out of it? Similarly, there's a question that says, what suggestions do you have for ways university can incentivize innovation among faculty, especially in the context where we don't have extra money to pay for course releases? So there's some kind of time constraints there.
Yeah.
So I think there's rigid hierarchy, there's time constraints, there's something about how do you allow it to flourish given that context?
Yeah. Well, one practice that again is in the book is called Shadow a Student, and this was actually developed in our in the K-12 sphere, but a very similar context where you have often very senior, very seasoned leaders who as you kind of climb the ranks within the administration, you get further and further away from that primary data of what's really going on with students. And often, there's lots of things that contribute to rigidity and sort of an unwillingness to change. But one of them can just simply be that someone has not had a deep connection or an observation that there are needs that are not being met. And especially the further that we get away from the classroom or from students, if your desire is to innovate around the student experience, for example, you really have to bring people back to that. So we have seen, in many schools, some success around engaging principals or, very senior teachers in doing the practice of shadowing a student, going, the entire day and really walking in the students' shoes, sitting in those small seats, having only 20 minutes for lunch, not having enough physical activity, having to move, through the schedule in the way that it's designed. And that often can just be the opening moment where someone recognizes there's work to be done here, right? To start to perhaps create some of that openness. So I really, really like that practice. In terms of the question around incentivizing innovation or helping to build a culture of innovation, particularly within constraints, I do think that in some cases, it can be really helpful to run an explicit project that is about trying to find more cost-effective ways to do something, right? Innovation does not have to be expensive or produce an expensive, new technology or something like that. So there can be ways to explicitly focus on something that is both of benefit, of value, but also could be a less expensive way to do that. There's a little bit of mythology around that. I think there can be. The question about how to get faculty involved if there's real constraints on the time. I share your pain. That is really a challenge. In my work at the D.School, I will say we tend to work more with faculty who are, through the tenure process. They have a little bit more flexibility, and often people who are really motivated by the experience of working across disciplines. Mm-hmm. And that for us, we have seen more traction over time with folks who genuinely spark. They light up when they have that experience of seeing the world through somebody else's eyes a little bit and having that really positive friction that can happen when you bring people together who think about things in different ways.
I love the shadow the student exercise. And I think that does hit on what is just a fundamentally human thing, which is unless you are inspired by it, unless you observe it in this really deep way, it's hard to feel motivated. It also makes me think of, I think one of the innovation dilemmas in the education sphere is actually a principal agent problem. In higher ed, you basically have two principals. You have the university, which has a view on what education's for, what success looks like, and therefore what we should be changing to better deliver on success. You have employers who have a view on what people should know how to do coming out of an educational experience and get to assert that view through their hiring. And then you have the learner, who actually rarely we design for, often because there's such powerful principles that are sort of overshadowing the needs, the motivations of that learner. And so we were missing all these opportunities for innovation because of this like principal agent dilemma. And just the basic act of shadowing or other sort of moments to really sort of dive deep and do that observation, I think can be one of the most sort of brilliant tools we have when it comes, especially when it comes to innovating for the public good and thinking more about the needs of modern learners.
I love that example.
Okay, going back to our questions. We have someone who works for a startup where there's a lot of ambiguity. What's a small step or design principle that they could start implementing tomorrow?
Well, there are so many. I think my answer would relate to the kinds of challenges that you're striving to solve. So if what you're trying to tackle is like, how do we work with, how do we embrace, how do we use all this ambiguity and opportunity that we have? I think that really doing some mapping of the opportunity that you see yourself in and pushing that a little bit further. So for example, the idea that we were talking about at the beginning, which is that design can show up in product, it can show up in experience, it can show up in systems. Push that even further and think about like, what are the social implications of the work that you're doing? Or maybe even in a more granular way, like think about how is data or technology a part of the canvas for design, right? So if you're in a situation where there's actually lots of room to think about like, what direction could we head in, that is a fabulous opportunity to like really take full advantage of what design can do. And there is a particular tool that I'm thinking about as I'm describing this, which is this idea of mapping the problem space in a very visual way, which can lead you to very unexpected insights about where you might take your project and the direction of the work that you're doing.
All right, this question feels timely in the last few years. How important is a shared physical space in order to have sort of creative cultures?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. We are all in the midst of a live experiment to try to understand that. I think that physical proximity is really important over the long term for relationships. I have seen many examples of where very, very creative work can be done using distributed teams. And I mean, increasingly, we're really going to see this play out as more and more companies are starting to move towards, a fully distributed workforce. I think that the tools that we have now that are available for visual, shared, creative collaboration, like Mural and Miro are really helping, but I still think you have to design the relationships that you want to have. And there's one teaching team at the D.school led by an amazing instructor named Glenn Fajardo, who that specializes actually in activating teams that are working across cultures and across geographies. And so he, for example, contributed to the book a great exercise that is about storytelling and building a rapport with someone without using the medium of language, right? So in the case where perhaps two team members are not just physically distanced, but have many more differences between them, how can you still build a rapport and start to build that relational trust that's so important for collaboration? So I've seen practices that can really help with that. I've also seen some research recently around the fact that in a time of prolonged separation, that the strong ties that exist within an organization can stay strong and perhaps even grow stronger, but that weak ties or bridging relationships, like between separate teams, are the ones that really suffer. And I think I'm chewing on that new insight and that data and trying to think about what does that mean for us at the D.school as we start to transition back to or actually into more of a hybrid environment, and to figure out how we rebuild some of those weaker ties and maintain those kinds of connections across the team.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And a few years ago, I got really interested by sort of how good ideas spread, especially in our higher ed communities. And I did a bunch of user interviews with people around like, where do your best ideas come from? Where does your inspiration come from? And people will say conferences, and they say, okay, well, tell me where and how at conferences. Is it like sitting in a, like, where are you? And it's typically the coffee chats. Sort of that they sort of bop out of the conference. They have this spontaneous interaction for 20 or so minutes. It's often over coffee. It feels a little bit more informal, very human. And it's where we were talking about hunches. It's where someone shares a hunch and then someone else shares another hunch, and those two things get combined to become the big idea. And I can't tell you the number of people who named the coffee chat space as the place where actually their inspiration came from. And so it really has gotten me thinking, as we've been fully digital for now 2 years, how do we actually create the coffee space like environment, not just with our closest colleagues and like one-on-ones, but with people who have different views than us, people who work on totally different sides of the organization, because those are actually the moments that I think people find the most inspiration.
And back to your point earlier of like, everybody has that one colleague who's like, oh, this is who I'm going to test out my hunches with. I think like finding new people like that is harder when you don't have the opportunity to like meet somebody at the water cooler. So I think that's another good example of where like we could be thoughtful about how could we create experiences for our teams that are really about building those kinds of relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's see what else we have here in the chat. We have a question here about moving from design to implementation. So we have dedicated design teams. They work hard to create the innovation. We have administrators that deal with their own form of ambiguity. Do you have examples or advice for moving from the design to actually implementing the work?
Let me think about a couple of examples. So one example that I think is perhaps like maybe a little bit more smaller and more focused than your question, but just came up for me. It was an example that I heard about. We asked actually a group of faculty who had participated in some of our learning experiences and who are distributed around the country to tell us some of their stories about using design to navigate ambiguity during the early days of the pandemic. And one of the stories that has really stayed with me was an example from a professor at a large public institution in the Midwest who, as part of her research, runs an outreach program where she connects students who are studying very technical fields with people who need technical expertise at the local public libraries. And in the moment in which the libraries had totally shut down, they couldn't run this program. So they completely rethought, like, what is this program if we can't actually connect with people, and we can't just connect with them on Zoom because they are coming, like the thing we are helping them with is dealing with technology. So they don't necessarily have either the access or the skills to connect with us. So through that process, they came up with some very interesting and kind of crazy ideas. Like they use some of our prompts and some constraints around, like, what would it look like if it had to use magic? What would it look like if it had to, only cost $1? And actually it was one of those ideas that led to this concept of a very, very simple tool where somebody with press of one button who really was not confident about technology could then access one of these student tutors remotely. And they wrote a proposal and they got an NSF grant to start to actually prototype what this device could be that could be so simple, or a way to convert an existing device into the tool that they needed to help make this connection. So, I think there's often opportunities, like once you've hit on the idea, to then actually attract some funding and support to take that into production. I'm curious about how you would answer that question, Allison, just given your background.
How would I answer that question? I personally feel like in many ways, some of the most important design work starts with implementation, especially if what you're doing hasn't been done before. It's when you are actually releasing it into the world is when you have the most user data and user feedback to actually be responsive to. And so I think one of the best practices for moving from design to implementation is to actually continue to treat it like design, and make sure you continue to have the mechanisms to capture and synthesize insights with a particular emphasis on the synthesis. I think we've built a lot of technical capability and general awareness of how important it is to understand the sort of behaviors and actions of the students, the users, whatever we want to call them that we're serving, and spend actually fairly not enough time on the synthesis, on like the sense making of what does this mean and what might we do about it. And I actually think that in its synthesis, not summary, which I think is a really important distinction, because synthesis allows us to actually take new action to build on the thing we originally designed to make it better, or to change course if it's not working. And so I think there's so much effort that often goes in, especially at an institution where you have to build consensus to do something new, to saying, this is the right answer, we have to go do it. That then the behavior is to justify the thing that you designed and to defend it. And I think instead we want to build cultures that allow us to say, it's actually a dynamic process of design. It's not something that's sort of done when it launches.
Yeah, I taught with a colleague who had been an official in the British government. We were teaching a class on innovation and public policy. And he always used to say that in that context, a pilot was usually just actually the first year of implementation. And so there was like a name for something that should have been more experimental and what you're describing in terms of like a continuation of a learning process. But in reality, all the investment and the if you did not have a successful pilot, the whole thing was deemed a failure. And so the location of where the stakes were versus where the learning were off in his estimation. That framing has always really stayed with me.
Yeah, I love that. This was such a joy, Sarah. Thank you so much for being in conversation with me and for teaching me this incredibly fun exercise at the top. I'm going to pass it to Kristen to wrap us up.
So Allison and Sarah, thank you so much. This was an incredibly enlightening discussion, especially for someone like me who has worked in this space of innovation in higher ed for a while now, at times with Allison, actually. So again, for those who are interested in purchasing a copy of Sarah's book, please visit the website, Independent Bookseller Book Culture. We will put the link in the chat now. And just a reminder that a limited number of signed copies will be available for this book. We hope to see you at our next event on Wednesday, June 22nd. That will feature Bill Kirby, Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration and T.M. Chang Professor of China Studies at Harvard University. Bill will be in conversation with Noah Pickus, Chief Academic Officer at Minerva Project. And Bill's recent book, Empire of Ideas, Creating the Modern University from Germany to America to China, examines whether the most preeminent global universities could, in the coming years, be found in China rather than in the United States. If you participated in the blind contour drawing activity, please don't forget to post your sketches to our community platform and share your thoughts on the exercise in that platform. We will link that in the chat now. Remember, if you post by Friday, you will be automatically entered to win one of the 3 signed copies of Sarah's book, Creative Acts for Curious People. You can find the link in the chat. Sarah and Allison have kindly agreed to join this conversation space over the next few days, and who knows, they might leave a comment on your drawing. Your feedback is really important to us, so please let us know what you thought of tonight's presentation by filling out our post-event survey. We will put a link in the chat for that now, and I think you'll receive that again in email. So again, thank you all for attending. We hope you have a good night, and we hope to see you on June 22nd. Thank you.